Under the pale morning light of Montana, a war veteran named Robert Carter stands on his frozen porch, breath misting in the cold. Beside him, his wife Evelyn tucks their son's drawing into her coat, a drawing of an old RV and a loyal German shepherd named Buddy. Behind them, the house creaks with memories of battlefields that never truly ended. When nightmares refuse to fade and silence becomes louder than gunfire, they pack what's left of their life into that RV and set off across America, searching not for adventure, but for peace. Through towns of strangers, storms, and faith, Robert learns that some scars don't disappear, they transform. And sometimes, God's miracles don't appear in bright light, but in a wife's touch, a child's laugh, and the soft heartbeat of a dog who never leaves his side. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a like. Your support truly means the world to us. Thank you from the bottom of our hearts. The morning in Helena, Montana arrived like a long exhale from the sky. Light flurries turned to powder, sifting down across the hunched pines and the wooden steps, purling along the eaves until each icicle looked like a note of glass ready to fall. The town made its winter sounds, remote, insulated, a single snowplow growling somewhere on Last Chance Gulch, a screen door thudding 2 houses over, a furnace coughing to life behind a neighbor's frosted window. Beneath a hand-painted sign that read, Carter House, the front door stood ajar, just enough for the cold to pry its fingers through. Robert Carter, 45, broad-shouldered and a shade stooped from carrying weight that didn't show, stood in the doorway with one palm on the frame, as if feeling for a pulse. His hair was black, salted with gray, cut short because neatness gave him a border to stand inside. A cold, dark beard, trimmed but stubborn, ran along a jaw that looked carved by long worry. His eyes were a stormy slate, watchful, scanning, always seeming to triangulate. Exits, angles, possibilities. On the middle finger of his right hand, a white seam of scar, a ragged thread where shrapnel had tasted bone, trembled when he reached for the knob. Inside, Evelyn Carter, 39, slight but wiry, her brown hair pulled into a practical knot, folded their son's cable-knit sweater with an efficiency that came from years of doing 5 things at once. She was pretty in a way that ignored cameras and recognized kitchens. Clean lines to her face, faint crescents of fatigue under steady hazel eyes, a mouth that could soften or steel in a single breath. She wore a thick olive cardigan over worn jeans, and the cardigan carried the ghosts of hospital soap and old coffee. Her beauty was endurance, not decoration. On the window bench stretched Buddy, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a black and tan coat that gleamed like polished wood under winter light. His muzzle was noble, his ears pricked like twin watchtowers. One ear showed a narrow white nick, souvenir from Kunduz, where he had dragged a bleeding private out of adobe dust while mortars stitched the air. Buddy's gaze had that old soldier calm you only get from learning the shape of chaos and deciding to sit anyway. "I called Dr. Linda Thompson," Evelyn said, her voice a careful warmth, the kind nurses use to give bad news a softer place to land. "Veterans group meets this afternoon. We should go, Rob." "Yeah," Robert said. The syllable hit the hardwood and cracked like thin ice. He pulled the curtain to a slit and listened the way other men looked, counting, mapping. A pickup 3 houses down, 2 crows beating their wings on the telephone pole, a neighbor's fireplace popping. Those pops sometimes mutated, inside his head, into IEDs singing their brief metal hymns. War to Robert was not a book you closed. It was a grid overlay still glowing across his brain's map. He had served 17 years, Iraq, Fallujah, Afghanistan, Kunduz, then Helmand, and later a training stint at Fort Benning, where his body healed, but his sleeps didn't. At 29, he'd taken a shard to the left chest. The scar ran like a rough stitch across the ribs, a seam that tugged when Winter asked him to breathe too deep. Once, a helicopter he was riding got chased by a patient rifle. He remembered how dust climbed in the cabin like a living thing, and how he had counted. 1, 2. Between shots, so fear could have rhythm. The moral wound, the one without a medic's fix, had entered him on a day he ordered a retreat that saved 6, but left 1 caught under crossfire. Tactically correct, spiritually expensive. He had paid, and still paid, in installments of silence, flinches, nightly audits of regret. While Robert went, Evelyn waited and raised. She had delivered their son Micah in a hospital that smelled of antiseptic apple and new paint, with the father's face glowing from a jittery satellite call propped near the bed. She worked 3 part-time jobs: grocery cashier with a smile taped on, in-home aid for the elderly, where she learned the names of pill shapes, and an ER night shift, where alarms taught her how adrenaline tastes. The cream-colored bills slid from envelopes like little doors to emptiness. On one winter night, when Micah burned with fever, she'd run through snow with him, wrapped in her coat, the sky above like a lid twisted on too tight. She learned to swap bulbs, fix a leaking trap, swing a hammer. Each time the hammer slipped, a crescent of blood bloomed at a nail bed. She would whisper into the sting, "Just one more day." Micah grew around photographs, his father in uniforms pinned to the refrigerator by fruit magnets. The boy would touch metals as though they were moons cooled into metal. "When is Dad coming home?" he'd ask. Evelyn would answer with a calendar and a bright pen, drawing stars on return dates that kept migrating across months like nervous birds. She taught him to say, "Good night, Dad," to a phone that slept black, the time zones refusing to share. Buddy joined the family when Robert entered rehab. The dog moved like a good thought through rooms, soft-footed, never clattering the shelves of memory. He lay down in the heaviest parts of the house like a doorstop against panic. That morning, Dr. Linda's voice had clicked warm through the phone. "PTSD isn't a character flaw," she said. "It's an injury. Biological. Conditioned. We can teach the body that wind is just wind." Evelyn had nodded, eyes reflecting 2 elements, water and tempered steel. Now she watched Robert pace. He walked like a shadow doing geometry, measuring corners, clearing sectors. He avoided dark pockets, policed open windows, hated fireworks. On the 4th, he stuffed cotton into his ears, curled around his skull on the bathroom rug, while Buddy pressed lengthwise along his hip to ground him. Insomnia braided itself to recurring nightmare. He would jolt awake soaked and smoke-eyed from scenes that only existed behind his eyes. Inside him was a minefield map. Certain smells, a specific engine whine, a silhouette at a window. Touch them, and everything blew. "Rob," Evelyn said, stepping into his orbit, her hand small and hot around his scarred knuckles. "We'll go. You don't have to talk." He took a breath like a man about to surface. "I can listen." Buddy stood, stretched the kind of stretch that resets a spine, then crossed and touched his tongue to the white seam on Robert's finger, the patient benediction of a sentry that knows endurance. The snow thickened into a hush that asked people to keep their voices soft. They drove to St. Agnes Community Center, a red brick cube with a metal ramp where old salt tracked in on rubber mats. A paper sign on a corkboard read, "Veterans and Families." Safe circle in block letters. A coffee urn exhaled steam into the multi-purpose room, where a Christmas banner put away late leaned across a wall with humility. Dr. Linda Thompson stood by a horseshoe of chairs. She was in her early 50s, Scandinavian pale, with cheeks that pinked easily in the cold, and wore her gray-streaked blonde hair in a low ponytail that admitted she had too much to do to manicure it. Her face was open in the honest way of a person who has sat through many kinds of crying and respects each kind. She wore oatmeal wool, sensible boots, and a necklace of worry beads that she fingered not for herself, but to model calm. Her voice had a therapist's cadence, but also a Montana mother's farm-bred practicality. "Welcome," she said, nodding at each arrival, as though they were important and not just broken. "Ground rules are simple. No fixing, no sermons, no shoulds. Just stories. And we don't let shame talk louder than names." They took seats. Tom Whitaker was 2 chairs down from Robert, a former Marine in his early 50s, a compact man gone soft around the middle, scalp a polished field with tufts at the edges. He wore his wedding band like a ring buoy and kept spinning it without knowing. His nose had been broken once and healed like a bend in a road. A rotator cuff surgery had taught him a new respect for sleep he still didn't get. He smiled with half his mouth, the other half always braced for the next thing. Next to Tom sat Aisha Brooks, late 30s, black, a former Army medic with shoulders like a runner and hands like a piano teacher. Her hair was braided neatly, pulled back with a cloth band stitched with mustard yellow sunbursts. Aisha's gaze was quick, analytic. She counted exits too, but mostly she counted breaths. A long, thin scar on her forearm told of a night when a boy's femoral artery tried to empty itself onto a cargo plane's floor, and her hand said no. Across from Aisha slouched Miguel Alvarez, early 40s, tattooed forearms scrolling up into the sleeves of his mechanic's navy coveralls. His face was handsomely rough, with cheekbones that could cut wire and stubble that could sand paint. The black ink on his right arm spelled a mother's name looped around a bleeding heart. His left carried a whole prayer in Spanish. He smelled faintly of oil and honest sweat. Miguel laughed easily, but it would die mid-air if a loud sound struck it. Buddy took position between Robert's boots, sphinx still, tail a question mark along the floor. Linda set a tin of peppermints on a low table, the kind of small trick that put sweetness into rooms where memory soured. "In here," she said, "we do the hard, slow miracle of telling the truth. Who wants to start?" Tom rapped knuckles on his knee, a Marine's drum. "If this is about talking feelings, I'll be a monk of silence." A drip of laughter moved around the circle, not wide, but genuine. It was the first valve turned. Aisha nodded at Robert, not pushing, just opening a lane. He cleared his throat and felt it like gravel. "I used to be good at math," he said, voice low. "Angles, timings. If a thing moved, I could guess where it would be next. What I can't seem to figure lately is where to put a hammer without my heart racing when I open the garage. I don't know how to rock a baby when he cries at midnight. And my hands," he flexed them, staring at the tendons that knot the back of a man's hands. "My hands keep thinking they should reach for a tourniquet. Sometimes I look at my boy, and I don't see my boy. I see children I didn't get to." The room stilled into a kind of respect that didn't need a nod. Buddy inched a paw onto the toe of Robert's boot, adding ounces to the earth. Evelyn inhaled, slow, measured, then placed her truth on the table like a plate she had kept warm. While he deployed, I learned to hear the wind hit the door and not panic. I learned to love a man who wasn't home, and to teach a child to love a father who wasn't in the pictures. I am good at this life. Her lips trembled once, then held. I am also tired. The last word landed like a stone set gently but finally in the center of the ring. Linda nodded, solemn, proud. The circle let the quiet do its work. Miguel broke it, scratching at the prayer on his arm. I keep thinking the muffler backfiring on a Civic is a back alley in Kandahar, he said. So I tell my brain, Ace, this is a Honda, not an RPG. Some days my brain is bilingual. Some days it refuses English. Brains are stubborn, Linda said, but trainable. We'll give them new drills. They talked for an hour, about nightmares that started with the harmless and ended with the unthinkable, about grocery stores at noon on a Saturday being worse than a firefight, about how shame is a liar that speaks fluent memory. Linda showed them a simple sequence. 5 things you see, 4 you feel, 3 you hear, 2 you smell, 1 you taste. The kind of grounding that rethreads the present through a body that thinks it's fallen. Evelyn wrote it on a sticky note and stuck it inside, and Robert's wallet like a small map home. When the session ended, they shook hands like teammates who had finally admitted the score. Tom slipped Buddy a contraband biscuit. He outranks us all, Tom said. Buddy accepted with a monarch's nod. Dusk came early, as it does to northern towns in winter. At the kitchen table, Micah hunched with a tongue caught at the corner of his mouth, drawing a vehicle with stubborn rectangles and an optimism of wheels. He was 8, lanky the way boys are when their bones are hurrying ahead of them. Hair the same dark shade as his father's, with fewer arguments with gray. Eyes the color of creek water in summer. He wore a red hoodie with a dinosaur whose teeth had been loved off in the wash. His default expression was earnest. His default speed, enthusiastic. "What's the project, bud?" Robert asked, pulling off his boots and lining them toe to toe because order shrank chaos. Micah held up the page. A recreational vehicle, blocky but proud. 3 stick-figure windows, and a 4th with a triangular ear. "It's us," he said, "on a trip, across America, like in the commercials. We stop at places and help people, and Buddy gets a medal." He pointed to a crude star on the dog's chest. Robert felt something crease in him that wasn't fear. He bit his lower lip, an old tell that he was protecting a smile from the world. "Ambitious," he said. "Do we have to be rich to go?" Micah asked. Evelyn ruffled his hair. "Not rich, just brave and frugal." "Is frugal like broccoli?" "It's like coupons for dreams." Buddy laid his head on Micah's knee as if acknowledging his portrait rights. He stared at the drawing, and something animal in him seemed to recognize a road. Bedtime came and went, with the normal negotiations about teeth and pages, and 5 more minutes. After Micah surrendered to sleep, the house lowered its lights. The furnace ticked. The fridge hummed. The December wind certified itself against the siding. Then the pop. Sharp, small, nothing, everything. A log in the fireplace split with a gunshot's confidence. In an instant, Robert was up, pulled by invisible wire. The world funneled tight. He was out on the front porch barefoot, breath tearing white ropes into the air. The sky above was a black lid seeded with stray diamonds. Snow fell hard and fast, turning to a storm of white bullets only he could hear. The old sounds arrived with terrible efficiency. A turbine scream, the barked count of a command, the drawn-out moan of a man realizing the hole in him had no bottom. His hand sought the shape of a rifle that wasn't there. His heart used a drum it had learned overseas. "Rob!" Evelyn's voice cut through like a wooden flute, low and sure. She came around him with a green wool blanket, one she'd kept on a chair for this exact wildfire, wrapping it around his ribs like a second set of hands. "Look at me. 3 things you see." He swallowed air like rocks. "Snow, streetlight, your eyes. 4 you feel. Blanket, your hand, porch rail. Buddy." He flinched, then stilled, because Buddy had pressed his full length against Robert's hip with the weight of a sack of grain, leaning until both of them were unavoidable. The dog's heartbeat thudded steady as an oath. "Buddy's fur. 3, you hear. Wind. The truck. Plow." He corrected it, made the word honest. "Plow. Your voice. 2 you smell. Pine smoke. Your shampoo. 1 you taste." He forced his tongue to move. "Mint. From the group." "Good," she whispered, palm firm on his sternum. "Now breathe with me. 1, 2, 3. They breathed like people trying to intrude on the same counted moment. The gallop under Evelyn's hand shortened to canter, then to walk. The porch came back into focus as a porch. The snow decided to be snow again. From far away, but also within the scene, the snowplow's amber light rolled, then vanished down the street. The wind had a different timbre now, less siren, more song. Inside the wool and inside each other, the Carters became 3 posts holding a tent up against a storm that had lost interest. They went in, closed the door, and the house accepted them. Warm animal. That it was. Robert sat at the kitchen table because chairs are governments for men who have fought too long. Evelyn made tea with automatic hands. Buddy lay across Robert's feet, a living heated rug. For a while they said nothing, which was exactly right. The clock on the stove clicked a minute forward, as if remarking on progress. A knock came, gentle, like a polite idea. Evelyn glanced at Robert. Question perched above her brow. He nodded. The blanket still looped his shoulders like a cape, too humble for a hero. He opened the door to find a mail carrier in a navy parka dusted with snow. The man was in his late 50s, compact and bright-eyed, with a postman's friendly stoop, cheeks ruddy from wind, and a mustache that had made peace with gray. His name tag read, Harold Greeley. His reputation in the neighborhood was, the one who knows which dogs bite and which dogs beg. "Evening, Mr. Carter," Harold said, stamping gently and holding out a padded envelope. "Certified. Came late on the truck. Figured you'd want it tonight rather than let it freeze on the dock." "Thanks," Robert said, taking the pen with fingers that had calmed enough to sign a name legibly. Buddy wagged once, the tail in ellipsis. "Good dog," Harold said with professional admiration. "Not a barker. A leaner. The leaners keep men on porches." He tipped his cap to Evelyn and left, leaving a small whirl of eddies behind him as the door shut. Robert set the envelope on the table. It was addressed in concise block letters. Military neat. Sergeant Paul Reed. Returnal in the return corner. Paul, the old squad, leader from Helmand. A man built like a log and carved by weather, who used to smoke hand-rolled cigarettes and tell the new guys that the only courage that counted was the kind you repeat. Reed's voice, in memory, had been a wooden bat, solid, dependable, occasionally blunt to a fault. "What is it?" Evelyn asked. "I don't know," Robert said. but something in his chest recognized the weight, literal and otherwise, of the mail. He slit the top with a butter knife and slid out a dog tag on a length of chain, dulled silver pressed with a name that tightened his throat. Nguyen, Charles. Beneath it lay a single photograph, 11 men before a mud wall, young and not yet resigned, with Charlie grinning wide enough to suggest he believed in returns. And under that, a folded map of the United States, speared with red pins in a diagonal that ran Montana to Wyoming, to the Dakotas, to Nebraska, and beyond. In the corner, a note in Paul's square hand. Carter, we're starting something. Story runs. Places where telling helps. I'm too busted to drive it. You're the wheel, if you say yes. Take the road for those who didn't make it back. Read. Robert stared at the pins. They looked like stars that had decided to come down to the paper to be practical. Evelyn read over his shoulder, resting her chin lightly against the wool on his shoulder. It's a map, she said, but her voice made it a proposition. Robert swallowed. His hands didn't shake. Behind his ribs, something approached. Not panic, something rarer. Buddy rose, put his front paws on the chair rung, and looked deliberately from the map to the door, as if to practice the idea of leaving. In the hallway, Micah's drawing of the RV waited on the console table where he had left it, wheels lopsided, windows cheerful. The furnace clicked again. Robert turned the dog tag over with his thumb. Charlie's name chilled his skin briefly, then warmed. Maybe, he said quietly, to his wife, to his dog, to the man he had been and the one he might be. The math I know isn't useless, after all. Evelyn's hand found his, knitting their fingers. Then the question, she murmured, is when? The house answered with a small sound from the vent, the wind muttering yeses down the chimney. Outside, the snow lightened, as if the weather had decided to listen. And from somewhere deep, near or far, memory or street, the sharp report of a backfiring engine cracked the night again. Buddy surged to the door with a short protective bark, and Robert stood, taller this time. He reached for the knob not to flee, but to look. He pulled the door open onto the white and the sound, and what he saw on the street under the street lamp made his breath catch. A familiar figure in a dark parka, a man with a log-built posture and a face carved by weather, trudging through the snow toward their steps. Paul, Robert breathed, because the past sometimes answered its own letters. The figure lifted a hand against the light. The morning after the storm arrived thin and luminous, a gauze of light thrown across Helena's rooftops. The snow had stopped its sermon in the night and settled into the quiet posture of aftermath, plowed ridges like folded quilts along the curb, a pale sky rinsed clean, the air so cold it chimed against your teeth. Inside the Carter house, heat clicked along the baseboards and made its own weather. The smell of coffee and pine, the small winds of a furnace's sigh, the silver whistle of a kettle finding courage. Robert Carter stood at the back door with the careful attention of a man reading a map only he could see. 45, jaw dark with a knight's beard that came in coarse, hair cut short enough to suggest discipline, had once been a survival skill and now was merely habit. He pressed each window latch, then pressed again. His right hand, middle finger etched with a pale, crooked scar, tested the deadbolt as if doors could promise anything more than delay. His shoulders were wide and slightly bowed. He wore last year's flannel, like a civilian uniform, and wool socks that had learned the floorboards. On the kitchen island, Evelyn Carter measured grounds into the French press with a nurse's unhurried economy. 39, slight the way steel cables are slight. Brown hair wound up into a loose knot that practiced practicality. Hazel eyes carrying the color of harvest fields and the vigilance of a mother who has slept in chairs. She moved with the fluid competence of someone who had stacked time in her hands. Midnight feedings, double shifts, homework folders, the 1,000 tendernesses of care that never made headlines. On the threshold between the kitchen and hall lay Buddy, a 6-year-old German shepherd, thick coat banded black over tan, a sleek ridge along his spine that rose and fell with breath. One ear held a thin white scar, a punctuation mark left in Kunduz when the air had burned and the ground had bucked. Buddy curled himself across the doorway, not to block it, but to remind the house of its edges. His eyes, amber, appraising, traveled the room, then returned to Robert with the careful steadiness of a sentinel who understands human weather as well as winter. Outside, a snowblower started 2 houses down and coughed into a steady roar. Robert flinched before the thought could catch up. That split-second concussive jolt, a body memory of engines with other intentions. Buddy lifted his head and leaned without moving, just a pressure, as if the floor itself had decided to be heavier. His shoulder against Robert's calf until the man's breath found its way back into a countable rhythm. "Coffee," Evelyn said, not because he didn't see it, but because naming safe things was part of their new grammar. She slid the blue mug with a chip on the rim, his, across the island. "Micah has his My Hero program today." Robert's mouth twitched. "He shouldn't pick me." "He didn't," she said, eyes smiling. "He picked all of us. He's 8. He understands heroes as a team sport." Buddy thumped his tail once, the punctuation of agreement. They dressed for the cold and stepped into the morning. The school parking lot looked like a fleet of igloos with wipers. Inside the gym, banners from seasons of basketball hung with that permanent optimism small towns keep for children. Paper stars lined the bleachers. Parents chattered in puffy coats. The scent of hot chocolate and glue sticks braided through the air. On stage, a 5th grader yanked the string of a confetti cannon, and the toy went off with a sharp pop, no bigger than a cork on New Year's, but close and sudden. In Robert's nervous system, a door slammed open by itself. He felt it before he could think it, the clutching contraction of everything. The pop became a mortar thump. The glitter's burnt plastic tang became melted polymer from a banged-up M-wrap. He pivoted, body interposed, shielding Evelyn the way you do when you don't know where the round will land. His eyes swept the room with math. Where to hide, who to pull, how to drop and roll a child without breaking his skull against cheap wood. Buddy, who had been lying dutifully beneath the first row, rose and planted 2 front paws on the toes of Robert's boots, a living door that refused to open toward the past. The big dog's weight said here, not there. Evelyn's hand reached the back of Robert's neck, thumb pressing that familiar notch, the home button of a human being. "Red shoes," she said softly, turning his face with the gentle insistence you reserve for a man and a boy. "Look." A little girl in a starry sweater marched across the stage in bright cherry sneakers. Robert named the color twice. Red, red, because repetition was a rope. "Now listen." Across the gym, Micah Carter waved from a cluster of 2nd graders, his black hair sticking up like careless hope, his mouth wide with a whistle he hadn't learned to make yet, just air and enthusiasm. "Dad!" he called. The sound traveled across tile and feet and landed. "Touch," Evelyn said. Robert gripped his jacket collar. The wool rasped against his fingertips instead of gauze. Buddy shoved his head under Robert's hand the way a horse offers its neck. The thick fur met palm. Something softened by increments. They asked permission to step out, and the gym swallowed their absence and kept its program moving because schools are good at pretending nothing painful happens. On the side lawn, the snow had peeled back to a patch of frozen grass, brown and stiff as bristles. Evelyn took his hands. In the distance, a flag flapped in a wind that wasn't a helicopter. Her voice lowered to the timbre she used with patients in an ER bay at midnight. "The 4th of July used to be my enemy," she said, eyes on the bare cottonwoods. "I'd crank the radio to drown the fireworks. I taught Micah to count every boom until we'd made a sky of stars inside the blanket. We didn't sleep much. We got good at making wishes." "I'm sorry," Robert said, throat tight. "No one apologizes for surviving," she answered. "We just keep practicing it." Buddy pressed his ribs against Robert's shin and stayed. At noon, they went to Brooks and Beans, the homey little diner on Fuller, where every table had a mismatched sugar bowl and the walls were a patchwork of vintage Montana postcards. Aisha Brooks, the owner, moved behind the counter with the athletic economy of a woman who'd carried stretchers with one hand and faith with the other. She wore a denim shirt with the sleeves rolled to reveal a pale seam of scar along the inner forearm, a reminder of the night she convinced someone's lifeblood to remain housed. Aisha's hair was a tidy crown of braids pulled back with a mustard yellow band. Her face made a broken nose and a beautiful smile coexist without apology. She set a bowl of chicken soup in front of Robert and a grilled cheese soon after, the kind cut on a diagonal because triangles made more sense. "I used to jump when a pot lid fell," she said, leaning a hip against the counter and letting her hand rest there, where he could see it not shake. "Thought my soul would never climb back into my body. 4 months of EMDR, following a little light across a bar while I talked through hell 1 square inch at a time. It's not magic, it's repetition that teaches your bones to refuse certain lies." "Does it end?" Robert asked. "No." She slid him a napkin and a smile. "But you get good at steering." A bell jangled, and Miguel Alvarez came in with his mechanic's jacket unzipped, dark hair tousled into purposeful chaos, jaw shadowed with honest stubble. Miguel had forearms tattooed with a mother's name and a prayer that could either save you or cuss you out, depending on the day. He clapped Robert's shoulder with that affectionate thump men use to keep tenderness from startling. "Had a Civic backfire on me in the bay yesterday," he said, sliding into the booth with the loose-limbed weariness of the self-employed. "Nearly ducked under my own toolbox. Told my brain, 'Relax, ese, that's a muffler with asthma.' Brain refused the joke for an entire minute. Then it laughed. Then it cried. Then it moved on." Buddy scooted under the table and parked on Robert's boots. Every so often, the dog lifted his head and leaned. People glanced, then continued their sentences. Helena knew the difference between a dog you should leave and a dog that would leave you worse off if you did. In the afternoon, the second circle met at the old church with the crooked bell. Dr. Linda Thompson had dragged in a box of laminated cards. "Grounding, activation" printed across the top in friendly font. The heat wheezed half-heartedly. The windows sweated. Men and women sat in metal chairs and adjusted themselves like people negotiating with their own bodies. Buddy lay in, the center like a hearth. A new face slid into the chair between Aisha and a woman with a buzz cut. She was Sarah Whitcomb, mid-30s, tall in the way that makes coats hang like capes, her hair the color of late wheat pulled into a low, no-nonsense ponytail. Freckles dusted across a narrow nose. Her eyes were an attentive green, the kind that made a person feel correctly spelled. She wore a librarian's cardigan over a t-shirt that read, "Ask me about interlibrary loan," and in her lap, she held a spiral notebook with a mechanical pencil clipped to it, like a faithful bird. Sarah introduced herself quietly. "Spouse, 2 deployments, 1 return, 1 divorce. I'm here to learn how not to take the war personally." Linda smiled in that small way that feels like a hand on your back midstream. "Welcome, Sarah. We specialize in not letting wars own nouns." Tom Whitaker, marine old, humor brittle, rolled his ring around and admitted he'd thrown a bag of groceries when a car backfired in the Safeway lot. Canned peaches don't dent like glory, but they dent enough to make you feel ridiculous. The room laughed because shame loses oxygen when other people refuse to feed it. Linda passed the box. "Everyone draw one." Robert's card read, "Write to the one who didn't come back." His throat tightened against the alphabet. He took a breath and began, pen grip too tight at first, loosening with each line. "Charlie. I wish I could say I would have done it different. I ordered a retreat that saved 6. It left you behind a low wall in the wrong wind. I brought you home by thinking of you every day. I did the small brave thing last night, stayed on the porch when the fire popped, instead of running into a winter that wasn't a war. You would have liked Micah's star counting. I'll tell him about you, so the world doesn't misplace your name. R.C." He read it aloud, and the word "here" cracked his voice. A chair creaked. A man coughed. No one moved to fix the feeling, which was its own fixing. Linda bowed her head, as if at a sacrament you can drink without a chalice. Next, Sarah read a list of ways she had learned to carry the absence of a husband, whose body sat at her dinner table, but whose eyes didn't. She didn't cry until she mentioned their old dog, Daisy, who used to put her head in his lap and remind him to come back to Earth for the length of a television commercial. "I don't have Daisy anymore," Sarah said, mouth bending. "I have books. They lean better than people." Buddy rose and crossed the circle as if called. He placed his chin on Sarah's knee with the solemnity of a knight, amber eyes holding kind, while asking nothing. Sarah's long fingers found his ear and traced the little notch like reading Braille. "Hi, soldier," she whispered. Buddy stayed, which seemed to make breathing possible for more than one person. They went on like that, trading little truths for the price of silence, which is about all you can afford some days. Evening came to Helena as a poem of sodium lamps and the blue hour. Back at the house, Micah constructed a cardboard RV at the dining table, tape looped around his wrist like a medal of sticky honor. He argued with a window he'd cut crooked, then decided crooked windows had character. On the console table in the hall, the padded envelope from last night, Sergeant Paul Reed, returning, sat opened but not yet fully answered. Its map of the United States lay unfolded, red pins marching like a constellation that had gotten practical. Buddy nosed the map, then trotted to the door. 2 deep booms from outside, like a big truck hitting a pothole in quick succession, reached through the wood. Buddy's head snapped, his body tightened. His ears triangulated the sound like radar dishes. "Plow," Robert said quickly, labeling the noise before the amygdala could freelance. Still, adrenaline crowded him. The old cocktail mixed without permission, and he crossed to the window and pulled the blind. Under the street lamp stood a man in a dark parka with the posture of a log that had cut other logs, snow dusting his knit cap and eyebrows, jaw a stubborn shelf. He lifted a hand in a gesture that said, both hello and I know I'm early. Paul Reed made the porch steps creak, the way only men who have lived their lives in boots do. Up close, he looked like a blueprint for the word sturdy. Mid-50s, sun-old, lines around his mouth from both cigarettes and laughter. Nose bent a degree left from a bad night long ago. Gray bristle along his jaw that would probably lose to a new razor, but make it work for the win. His eyes were the pale blue of Montana sky in February. Bright, honest, unforgiving of pretense. Robert opened the door, felt a dozen years assemble and stand to attention inside his chest. "Paul," he said, and the syllable untied something behind his ribs. "Carter." Paul took him in with a commander's inventory and a friend's relief. He clapped Robert's shoulder once, hard enough to say alive. He touched his knit cap to Evelyn, with courtesies men like him had learned from mothers and chaplains. "Ma'am." "Come in," Evelyn said, because warmth was policy here. "We have coffee and grilled cheese scraps." Paul stepped into the heat and stomped the snow off his boots in a way that suggested that if evil showed up, he'd stomp that too. He smiled at Buddy. No teeth, all respect. "Damn fine dog," he observed. "Leaners save lives." "Been doing that," Robert said. Paul untucked a manila folder from under his coat and set it on the table beside the map. He sat with his hands around the mug Evelyn slid toward him and let the steam find his face. He looked older than the photograph in the envelope, older than memory would allow without making allowances. When he spoke, it was the old bat. Solid. Simple. "You got my package," he said. Robert nodded. The dog tag lay on the table, silver, dulled, name pressed so clear the letters felt recent. Nguyen. Charles. The world had tried to keep the man small. The metal refused it. "I did." Paul's gaze rested on the tag and went somewhere no one else could go. He cleared his throat, swallowed gravel. "I wrote to 3 men from the squad," he said. "Only 2 are still breathing. Only 1 answered. Then I figured I'd stop asking anyone to write and ask someone to drive." He flipped open the manila folder. Inside were printouts, a small town church bulletin from Williston, a community center flyer from a reservation in Oklahoma, a scribbled address for an encampment under a Portland bridge, a librarian's note from Sioux Falls. "We can host a reading if the group is small and the dog is well behaved." Red pins for each, echoed on the map. The story run, Paul called it. 2 years ago, he went on, I had a stroke. Not the big one. The mean little kind that makes your left foot forget. I can't drive long. But the stories still need moving. You always knew angles, Carter. You can thread roads between towns the way you threaded alleys. There are men and wives and old mothers out there who need to hear a person say, "It wasn't just you." Evelyn sat across from him, both hands around her own mug. She watched the way he cradled his, left thumb lagging a fraction behind the right, a tremor hopping under the surface, the sleeve of his parka riding up enough to reveal a hospital bracelet's faint tan line. Her nurse's mind took notes. Her wife's heart translated them. "What about you?" Robert asked, meaning your wounds. Paul shrugged with the gallows humor of a platoon. Half a face that doesn't listen, a foot that forgets, a son who hasn't called since the year I taught him to drive stick. The wife left when the VA got better at hold music than answers. But I got a mouth, and it still works. I can stand in front of a room and translate soldier to civilian. I can tell him about this dog right here and how leaning is a service too. Buddy, who had been lying like a rug, rose and put his head against Paul's knee, the same benediction he'd given Sarah earlier. Paul's fingers sank into the rough, grateful without show. You'll say yes, Paul said, not as an order, but as a habit of seeing the battlefield and calling the right move. When you're ready. Robert drew a slow breath that didn't hurt. He looked at the map. The red pins weren't nails, not anymore. They were beacons. His eyes caught one in Casper, Wyoming, handwritten in the margin. Mrs. Lan Nguyen, nursing home. Wants to hear about her boy. Asks for the tag if it ever turns up. A heat wavered in his chest that wasn't panic. It was purpose's first candle. Charlie's mother, he said, voice thinner than he wanted. Paul nodded. She writes letters to the editor about potholes and how the grocery store took out the benches where old folks used to rest. She bakes Lehman bars for funerals of people she never met. She keeps that funeral knowledge sharp. She's asked for that tag for 11 years. Evelyn set her mug down with a decisive clink. Then Casper is first, she said. If we go at all, we go toward a mother. Silence settled the way quilts do, meant to cover, not to smother. Robert let it sit across his shoulders. The years without him, the 17 behind wire and sand, the 8 where Evelyn managed receipts and rehearsed brave faces, Buddy's 6 years of work and watch, gathered like witnesses in the room. Let me tell you something about him, Paul said, tapping the dog tag with a forefinger. Charlie believed in dumb luck and good planning. He bought lottery tickets and cleaned his weapon like a religion. He said heaven would smell like jasmine rice. He laughed too loud. He cried in a tent once when a stray dog followed him around for a week and then didn't show up one morning. The next day he snuck out MRE meatballs to bait a different stray and make a new friend. That's the kind of soldier he was. He'd make a friend with grief if it wagged. Robert's laugh broke through his own chest like a thaw. Evelyn leaned back and closed her eyes, relief moving through the fine muscles of her face like weather improving. Buddy sighed, one of those long canine exhalations that empties a room of leftover ghosts for a minute. Tell me about Buddy, Sarah said later that evening, when the group reconvened for a second cup and the kind of talk that prefers kitchens to offices. She had stayed, returning a book she'd promised Micah, and lingering because the house had a way of granting permission even to strangers. She sat at the table's corner, tall frame folded carefully to fit the humble chair, her freckles brightened by kitchen lamp. Robert stroked the dog's scarred ear. He's 6, came out of Lackland, K9 training. Learned to track scent like it was gossip. Worked 2 tours. Saved a man by pulling him by the collar across a yard full of bad decisions. Hates helicopters. Rotor chop makes him brace. Diesel makes him check exits. He's a leaner, not a barker. Barking is warning. Leaning is reminding. You both learned to press weight, Sarah said, half to herself. The rest of us learned to carry it. Evelyn's eyes found Sarah's, the silent recognition between women who had learned to sleep with an ear open. What did you do while he was gone? Evelyn asked. Sarah smiled down at her notebook. Shelved books like building scaffolds. Ran laps around the lake at dawn because I needed a horizon I could finish. Befriended a cat named Atlas because I thought if I held him, he'd help me hold everything else. She shrugged, a long line of muscle rolling under cardigan wool. Atlas did what cats do. He refused metaphors and sat on my face at 5 a.m. anyway. They laughed, and laughter is a polite violence to sorrow. It cuts without a injuring. Paul pushed back from the table and stood with a careful transfer of weight that admitted his left foot's betrayal, but didn't give it the microphone. He zip-lined his knit cap onto his head. If you go, he said, I'll call ahead. Churches, union halls, library basements. People like to show up for dog stories that are actually people stories. And there's one more thing. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, a used RV listing circled in red. Woman named June Harrelson, widow, retired music teacher. Kept her RV like a Stradivarius. Says she'll sell it cheaper if the road you take is good. Evelyn glanced at Robert, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with partnership. The ledger, the logistics, the leap. She thought of night shifts she could trade for telehealth, of neighbors who had already promised to help watch the house, of a school counselor who could set Micah up with travel-friendly assignments. She thought of all the years without him, her without him without himself, and felt the strange lightness of maybe. "We'll sleep on it," she said. "We'll dream on it." Paul nodded. Dreaming is reconnaissance. He pulled open the front door. Cold reached in to shake hands. As he stepped onto the porch, a black pickup rumbled past, tailpipe coughing twin reports into the street. Robert's shoulders rose. Buddy rose with him, leaned. This time, Robert identified it before fear could dress it up. Exhaust. He didn't move his feet. He let the sound go by like weather. From the hallway, Micah's cardboard RV leaned against the console table, crooked window and all. The boy's backpack lay on its side, a library book half out. The Lives of Dogs Who Saved People. On the cover, a shepherd had the same patient ears. Robert touched the red circle around June Harrelson's listing, then the pin near Casper. "If we go," he said, "we start with a delivery." He lifted the dog tag. It was cold enough to remind skin about memory. Mrs. Lan Nguyen waited on the map like a prayer someone had written neatly so God could read it. Evelyn gathered the coffee cups and carried them to the sink, sleeves pushed up, wrists slender and strong. "We start with a mother," she echoed. A moment later, the phone on the wall jangled, old-fashioned, with a curly cord and a loyal clatter. Evelyn wiped her hands and answered. She listened, then pressed the receiver to her shoulder. "It's Nurse Supervisor Rosa Medina," she whispered to Robert. Rosa, 50, compact and immovable in the way of nurses who had seen most endings and refused certain ones. Brown eyes bright with pragmatic kindness, hair pulled into a bun that suggested no nonsense would be tolerated within a 5-foot radius. "A traveling clinic in Casper needs a weekend triage RN next week. Short notice. She asked if I could recommend someone who can do fast intake and long patience." Robert's eyes met Evelyn's across the kitchen, a line taut and humming. Paul stood in the doorway, the cold framing him like punctuation. "Tell Rosa you know someone," Robert said, voice steady. Evelyn smiled into the phone. "I know exactly the person," she said, "and she works for sandwiches and stories." She hung up. The kitchen clock ticked like a countdown to something other than disaster. Buddy leaned into Robert just enough to confirm that choices are best made with weight applied. "Tomorrow," Paul said, hand on the knob. "I'll come back with a mechanic who can smell trouble in a fan belt and a pastor who knows how to bless tires." He grinned, a flash of old mischief cutting through the weather lines. "We'll pretend we're not superstitious and be superstitious anyway." He stepped into the winter, the door shut behind him with a human sound. Robert lifted the dog tag and held it up so it caught the kitchen light. He looked at his wife. He looked at his son's crooked window dream. He looked at his dog, whose ear carried proof that kindness can scar and keep working. "Okay," he said. "We go." From the street, a gust of wind shoved against the house and then gentled, like a big hand deciding to pat instead of push. Somewhere inside, a pipe ticked twice. In the quiet that followed, the Carter's future made a small, definite noise as it turned on its hinge. And then the kitchen light flickered, just once, the sort of wink old wiring gives before a storm or a decision, and the room held its breath as the bulb decided to stay lit. The day the snow finally relented, Helena woke under a rinsed blue sky so bright it felt audible, a clean ringing that came from light touching everything it had ignored during the storm. The road to Fort Harrison cut through fields the wind had combed flat. Drifts slumped like tired shoulders along the fence line. The air had that metallic clarity that makes breath feel borrowed. Robert Carter drove with the careful, steady hands of a man who had learned to listen to engines as if they were animals. Every click, every subtle change of pitch. Beside him, Evelyn watched the horizon with the same poise she used to watch monitors in an ER, alert but unafraid. Her brown hair, knotted at the nape, pushed against the collar of her parka. The lines at the corners of her hazel eyes were not age so much as record. In the back, Buddy, 6-year-old German shepherd, sat with his chest forward and his paws planted like a hymn, amber eyes absorbing fences, ditches, birds short-cutting across winter. He wore his working harness, the one with a handle, and the old nick in his left ear showed pale against the darker fur. Every so often, a semi's downshift droned along the highway shoulder, and Buddy's ears twitched and set, calibrating. Every so often, Robert's right hand left the wheel to stroke the dog's ruff without looking. They were two organisms with a shared map of hazards and mercies, and the road between. At the veteran cemetery, the world simplified. Rows of headstones in white cadence marched across a mild slope toward a fringe of spruce. Flags resting from wind lay limp as sleeping birds. Footprints stitched cautious routes where family had come with flowers and left with quieter faces. Robert carried a bunch of white tulips in his gloved hand. Evelyn's tulips grown in a dented bucket on the back step all summer, because she believed you should raise something that doesn't ask for explanations. They found Charles Nguyen where he had always been since the day he stopped being anywhere else. Robert set the tulips, straightened the stems as if the gesture could impart dignity, then stood with one fist over the seam shrapnel scar beneath his coat, as close to his heart as a man who sometimes mistrusted his heart's location. He didn't speak. He let breath fog from him in proof. He let the earth receive the recognition and return the steadiness earth returns. A scuff of boots on snow to their right. Sergeant Paul Reed came first, shoulders squared in a dark parka. The knit cap low on a brow that carried a scar faded to the faintest rumor. His jaw a carpenter's shelf. His blue eyes were winter sky kind, honest, bright, intolerant of lies. He lifted a hand in a motion that was half salute, half old friend shorthand. With him came Hank Morales and Old Joe, two names that had lived in Robert's pocket for years without faces to wear. Hank, mid-40s, shorter than Robert, built like a compact gearbox, had a dark mustache trimmed militant neat, a widow's peak sharp as a decision, and forearms roped by the kind of manual work that forgives no shortcuts. The tattoo on his left hand, 3 small dots, hid under the glove, but the angle of his jaw told a story of nights he'd navigated trouble long before the army offered structure. Old Joe, not actually ancient, 60, maybe a stubborn 65, stood tall because men who worked the land don't know the habit of stoop. His hair was a drift of white, his cheeks carved by laughter and weather, his nose veered a polite degree from straight, and his beard came in uneven, like a field. Refusing uniform rows. He wore a battered brown coat with the collar permanently bent wrong and the relief of the sober in his eyes. They formed a lopsided semicircle around the stone. Paul reached out, clapped Robert once on the shoulder, knuckles a little slow because the left side still forgot itself. "I heard you wrote to Charlie," he said, voice deep and stubborn as fence post. "You should deliver it to 100 men who need to hear what you told him." Evelyn, hands tucked in her pockets for warmth and restraint, tilted her head. "Where?" Paul pulled a folded map with red pinholes, already tired from handling. "Places that take stories like medicine. A basement room in Williston. A tribal center down in Tahlequah that keeps the coffee hot, and the chairs in a circle long after the budget's gone. A union hall in North Platte where men come to talk when their hands finally stop shaking. A tent city under a Portland bridge that has a book club because a woman with a shopping cart decided they should." His mouth did a brief, reluctant smile. "It's a current. We ride it. You have Buddy. You have words. You have eyes that saw and did not quit. Go." Robert looked at the pale contour lines of the Dakotas and Wyoming. In his head, noise fell away, replaced by a clean mechanical music. Wheels, road seam, wind rush. For a long time, the math in him had been applied to tuck, cover, fire, retreat. Now it rearranged itself into miles, stops, rooms, a different kind of extraction. He thought of Micah's stubborn drawing of an RV, windows like hopeful eyes. He thought of the cardboard version on the dining table, the crooked window still crooked, and therefore true. He thought of the dog tag in the kitchen drawer, its stamped letters cool as a lake. "Okay," he said, but only to himself. Buddy went to ground with the sigh a dog makes when a plan aligns with his idea of loyalty. On the way back to the car, they passed a woman with a red scarf, bringing a thermos to a name. A young man whose head was recently bare of hair and still shocked by wind. A volunteer aligning a toppled flag with mittened precision. Wound, care, wound, care. The place was a pattern. At home, everything quickened. Micah exploded from the hallway in a red hoodie, a paper in his hand, and triumph in his legs. "I get to read my hero next week," he said, hair shot upward by joy, cheeks hot with the heat of children who run between rooms. He thrust the paper up. 3 stick figures and a dog. The RV's roof, now correctly glued. "I want to say it's all of us. You and Mom and Buddy, and maybe Mr. Paul because he walks like a hero." "Heroes often limp," Evelyn said, meeting Paul's eye with a small salute. After dinner, they cleared the table not just of plates, but of confusion. Evelyn spread a ledger notebook and began her arithmetic of courage. Sell the sedan that burned more oil than miles, empty the cautious savings they had guarded like a candle in draft. Apply for a small grant from the VFW chapter, where Hank knew a treasurer who both respected paperwork and understood hunger. "I can pick up telehealth overnight intakes and short clinic shifts when we stop," she said, tapping her pen against weeks on a printed calendar. "Rosa knows I'm good with hurry and kindness. She'll pass my name." Robert scratched at the breadcrumb grit in his beard and watched Buddy watching him. "I'll talk," he said. "To whoever shows up, I'll say the thing I always needed to hear. This doesn't mean you're broken beyond use. Then I'll shut up and listen." Buddy made a low affirmative sound and laid his chin across Robert's knee. The weight was vote and vow. Evelyn put her hand over Robert's. The bones of their fingers interlocked with the relief of joints returned to sockets. "You followed orders for a long time," she said. "This time it's our orders. Go to heal. For us. For them." What followed was a week of rehearsing goodbye. They laid out everything they owned in rows on the living room rug until possessions looked like offerings. They sold the couch with the crayon comet Micah had drawn when he was 4, and remorseful about 2 minutes later. The buyer, a young couple with hopeful hands, didn't mind the comet and called it a story. They kept the small wooden elephant with a broken ear because Micah said it looked like a listening animal now. Mrs. Ruth Lang, their neighbor across the street, arrived with a pie that had a woven crust worthy of fair judging. Ruth was 70, blossom white hair permed into an obedient wave, lipstick unapologetically rosy, hands freckled and decisive. She had taught elementary reading for 30 years and still spoke to adults as if they were worth the same patience. "If you don't let me put a casserole in your freezer, I will call your mother," she said, although neither Carter had a mother reachable by phone. "Bring me postcards from wherever they still sell them." She patted Buddy with exactly the gravity you offer a parish priest. Kyle Jensen, the neighborhood mechanic in his early 30s, with the lean meat look of a runner and the thump-sure hands of a man who had fixed tractors at 13, backed his pickup into their driveway with a toolbox rattling like a tin choir. Kyle wore a cap with his shop's logo worn, white at the edges, auburn beard trimmed neat, eyes cornflower blue and kind. A right forearm had a scar ladder from a teenage ATV flip, which made him patient with machines and boys. He bled their brake lines, replaced a serpentine belt, listened to the RVs idle with his head cocked like a bird. "She's old but honest," he said. "Like my Uncle Brett. Keep an eye on the temp gauge climbing passes, and don't bully her into headwinds. Treat her like a friend who already lifted a couch for you." He showed Robert how the fuse box wanted to be touched. Gentle, left thumb on the housing to calm the quiver. Ms. Nora Quinn, Micah's teacher, stopped by with a manila folder of assignments and a map of the United States with state flowers printed in cheerful watercolors. Nora was late 20s, Irish pale, freckles bold, hair cut in a blunt bob that made her look perpetually ready for a brainstorm. Her cardigan was mustard. Her earrings were tiny pencils. She smelled faintly of dry erase markers and orange slices. "As long as he keeps a journal and reads across 3 time zones," she said, scribbling her email in a confident loop. "He'll be as smart as the kids who stayed. Maybe smarter if he learns all the state birds by the time you're back. Extra credit and bragging rights." She knelt to Buddy, and Buddy accepted her handshake like a gentleman. Robert went to the garage and opened the old wooden box, where he kept things that had seemed once to require guard duty. Medals that felt heavy out of proportion to the acts they commemorated. A letter from his mother, in careful cursive, who had loved him sternly because softness scared her. A photograph of 11 men before a mud wall in Helmand, faces smooth with youth, eyes already older than those faces deserved. He traced each mouth with a finger, an almost prayer, an accounting. "I'm sorry," he said to the ones who had not come home. "Today, I choose to live." From the array, he pulled only one, Charlie's grin, squinting into bad sun. He slid it into the pocket sewn inside his coat, the one close to the scar. On the dining table, Evelyn taped a sheet of paper she titled, "Carter Road Rules" in block letters, because manifestos belong to households too. 1. Help at least one person at every stop. 2. Tell one true story. 3. Plant a tree if possible. 4. Share a meal with a stranger family. 5. End each day naming 3 gratitudes. Micah, with a marker that bled a little, added, 6. Feed Buddy first. Buddy wagged without false modesty. Paul returned mid-week with a man who could hear if a bearing was going to betray you from across a parking lot. Dennis Denny Pike, late 40s. Big in the chest the way men are, who never learned to sit through entire movies. Brown beard going salt at the corners. Grease crescents under his nails, like permanent half-moons. He had been a motor pool wizard in country, and a truck stop savior stateside. Denny wore a Carhartt jacket that had earned its stains and a grin too easy not to trust. "Bless your alternator," he said, half joke, half sacrament, and then did. With them came Pastor Lyle Morton, a man in his early 60s, whose face achieved the rare feat of being both solemn and amused, hair silver and combed the way air teaches, a navy peacoat buttoned with the dignity of sailors. He smelled faintly of candle soot and old hymnals. His handshake was the warm firm of someone accustomed to holding grief without wrestling it. He didn't make a big circle or say many words. He simply stood by the RV and put one hand on the hood, as if on a forehead, and said, "May your wheels never forget home. May your brakes be stronger than fear. May your nights be decently quiet. And may every table you sit at teach you the right hunger." Denny winked. "That's the deluxe package, folks." The RV, cream paint with a sky blue stripe, a little oxidation on the edges like laugh lines, got scrubbed by Micah and Ruth with suds and pride. Evelyn stocked the small galley with a nurse's calm foresight. Gauze, tape, ibuprofen, a stethoscope, a blood pressure cuff, a roll of those stickers that say you were brave. She labeled bins not because she couldn't find things, but because order is a kindness you pay forward to your future panicked self. Robert practiced merging onto icy roads with caution and resolve. He learned the sweet spot of speed where the old engine sang instead of complained. He learned the exact pressure of pedal that made Buddy shift from alert to relaxed. He stuck the red-pinned map to a corkboard over the dinette. Casper, Wyoming, was circled and underlined. Mrs. Lan Nguyen, written in Evelyn's precise nurse letters. They called the number Paul handed them for June Harrelson, the retired music teacher with a for sale sign on an RV she had tended like a Stradivarius. June's voice came lightly across the line, high and reedy, a fluting quality that suggested decades of telling children to drop their shoulders and breathe. She was 68, she said, short and straight-backed, hair a helmet of white fluff she treated with a dignity comb. She lived on the north side and had named the RV Clarence because it ferried children to summer music camps without complaint for 20 years. "He still wants to go places," June said. "I want him to go somewhere that matters. If a mother is waiting, take him for less than the number I wrote down. My late husband believed you should give discounts to righteous journeys." Robert and Evelyn drove over and found June with piano teacher posture and the soft chalk smell of practice rooms around her. She demonstrated switches and quirks like a recital program. How Clarence liked you to coax the awning rather than order it. How you had to jiggle the bathroom latch with 2 different intentions. How the heater would sulk if you starved it of propane. "Sing to him on hills," she advised, straight-faced. Then she laughed and revised. "Or hum. Engines like to know they're not the only ones working." Papers signed. Hugs exchanged. A tin of oatmeal cookies pressed into Micah's hands with instructions to ration and ignore those instructions. They took Clarence home. The night before departure arrived with the soft fray of new snow drifting down like ash from some invisible, benevolent fire. The cream and blue RV idled in the driveway, engine purring the way June had promised, a low cat contentment in chest and hood. Evelyn clicked shut the last latch on the medical kit. Micah tucked a pencil case into the cabinet over the table, then added the state birds map, then a dinosaur for luck, violating his own rule about packing light without remorse. Buddy hopped into the passenger footwell, and then onto the bench, then back down, rehearsing positions, trying to smell the road through a closed door. Robert stood on the front steps a moment looking at the house, the Carter height marks on the door jamb, the carved notches making a timeline of a boy's campaign against gravity. The house returned the look without pleading. He heard the ghosts, fireplace pop, kettle hiss, storm hand slaps on siding. But another sound called from the end of the street, a chorus of rooms he had not yet sat in, breaths he had not yet counted with strangers who needed a metronome that could keep time without judgment. Evelyn slipped her hand into his. "Ready, Captain Carter?" she asked, the title offered with equal parts tease and honor. Robert's mouth did something it hadn't done easily in years. It smiled without reservation, teeth and tore truth. "Ready, Nurse Carter." "Dad!" Micah yelled through the open window, hair mad with anticipation, cheeks apple bright. "Buddy took your seat." Buddy gave a short, amused woof that could have been a drum roll. Robert got in. In the mirror, the house grew small almost immediately. He flipped the mirror down so his windshield held only now. His hands, these hands that had known tremor from artillery that never arrived, were steady on the wheel. Evelyn turned the radio to a country station where somebody was still writing letters in a lap at a truck stop. Micah attempted a whistle and, failing, invented a high, happy wind. Buddy put his front paws on the window ledge and watched the mountain shoulder slide by. The RV rolled, tires compressing snow into a silver seam that stitched the street back together as they passed. The map with the red pin swayed over the dinette, like a constellation making new promises. The list of rules fluttered once and then lay flat, certain of its own logic. Buddy shifted, leaned against Robert's shin whenever a plow thumped down the block, then relaxed when the thump turned back into normal. The road tipped toward Wyoming, the Dakotas, Nebraska, and towns whose names sounded like kindness if you were tired. They carried the weight that had tried to carry them. They carried a dog tag that wanted to go home. They carried a boy's crooked window dream. They carried the capacity to count breaths until a room trusted itself again. The United States opened like a book that had forgotten no one's name. Behind them, a small house remembered a family and felt proud. Between those two truths lay a machine named Clarence, a man named Robert, whose math had converted from angles of fire to miles of mercy, a woman named Evelyn, whose patience had proved its power, a boy named Micah, who believed heroes were teams, and a dog named Buddy, who would keep leaning until the country learned to stand without flinching. And the current that had always been there, beneath the noise, beneath the drills, beneath the grief, finally turned visible and took them. And as Clarence the RV vanished into the white distance of the Montana highway, something unseen began to move, a quiet current, gentle yet divine. Some call it faith. Some call it love. Robert called it breathing again. Evelyn called it peace. Buddy simply leaned closer, as if he could already hear the whisper of God in the wind. They weren't just leaving a house. They were stepping into grace. Every road would test them. Every sunrise would remind them that healing is not a destination, but a daily miracle. Perhaps that's what the Lord meant all along, that the broken are His favorite instruments, because through their cracks, His light finds its way out. And maybe, somewhere in your life, a road like theirs waits too, the kind that begins when you finally stop running from your past and start walking with it toward hope. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to share it. Leave a comment about the miracles you've seen, the people or pets who helped you heal, and the quiet ways God still speaks to you through ordinary days. Subscribe to this channel, not just to follow Robert, Evelyn, and Buddy, but to travel with them as they rediscover love, faith, and the rhythm of their own hearts across the vast, blessed land of America. Because their story isn't over. The journey of healing, of finding purpose, and the pulse of grace has only just begun. And in the miles ahead lie strangers, who will become family, wounds that will become wisdom, and miracles that only God Himself could have written. May the Lord bless and keep you, and may His light guide you through your own storms until every road becomes a prayer and every sunrise a promise. See you in the next chapter of the healing journey, where the Carters learn that miracles don't just happen to us, they happen through us.